I never thought that the moment I'd waited for my entire life would become the moment that destroyed everything I believed about myself. My name is Margaret, I'm 54 years old, and for 35 years, I devoted every breath in my body to taking care of my father and building his empire. I sacrificed my own dreams, my own relationships, my own life, believing that one day, all of this dedication would mean something. That one day, I would finally be seen as worthy. But sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones holding the sharpest knives behind their backs. The morning of December 15th started like any other, but it would end as the day that split my life into before and after. I remember standing in front of my closet, choosing my best navy blue suit. I wanted to look professional, dignified, ready to finally claim what I had earned through decades of unwavering loyalty. My father had called me the night before, his voice unusually shaky, telling me it was time to sign the inheritance papers. After years of promises and delays, he was finally ready to transfer the family business to me. I had built that business with my own hands. When my father's arthritis made it impossible for him to work, I stepped in. When his memory started failing, I became his memory. When his friends and business partners doubted his decisions, I became his voice of reason. I transformed a struggling local construction company into a multi-million-dollar empire, and everyone in the industry knew it. Everyone except the one person whose opinion mattered most. The law office of Morrison & Associates felt different that morning. Usually, when I walked into Mr. Morrison's office, I felt confident, in control. But something in the air seemed heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Mr. Morrison, a man I'd known for over 20 years, couldn't quite meet my eyes when he greeted me. His usual warm handshake felt cold, distant. My father was already there, sitting in the leather chair across from the massive oak desk. He looked smaller than usual, almost fragile, but there was something in his posture that I couldn't quite read. Tension? Guilt? I brushed off the feeling and took my seat beside him, ready to finally claim my rightful place. Margaret, Mr. Morrison began, shuffling through papers with hands that seemed unusually nervous. Your father has asked me to prepare these inheritance documents, and we're here today to finalize everything. I felt my heart racing with anticipation. After all these years, after all the sacrifices, after all the times I'd put his needs before my own, this was it. This was my moment of validation. The moment when my father would finally acknowledge that I was worthy of carrying on his legacy. But as Mr. Morrison spread the papers across the desk, I noticed my father's hands were shaking. Not the gentle tremor of age, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like fear. Before we proceed, my father said, his voice barely above a whisper, there's something I need to tell you, Margaret. Something I should have told you a long time ago. The words hit me like ice water in my veins. In all my years of knowing my father, he had never spoken to me with such weight, such gravity. Whatever he was about to say would change everything. Dad, what's wrong? I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, and in that simple gesture, I felt the first crack in the foundation of everything I believed about our relationship. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in his eyes that terrified me. It wasn't love. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even disappointment. It was guilt. Deep, crushing guilt that seemed to age him 10 years in that single moment. Margaret, you've been the best daughter I could have asked for, he began, and my heart soared for just a moment before he continued. But you're not my daughter. The world stopped. The air left my lungs. The sound of my heartbeat became so loud I was sure everyone in the room could hear it. I stared at him, waiting for him to laugh, waiting for him to say it was some kind of cruel joke. But the silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. What do you mean? The words came out as barely a whisper. You're not my biological daughter, Margaret. You never were. And in that moment, everything I knew about myself, everything I had built my identity on, crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. The room seemed to tilt, and I gripped the arms of my chair to keep from falling. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. But my father wasn't finished destroying me yet. The silence in that office was deafening. I could hear the tick of the antique clock on Mr. Morrison's wall, marking seconds that felt like eternities. I stared at my father, this man I had called Dad for 54 years, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of mistake, some kind of misunderstanding. "I don't understand," I finally managed to say, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "What do you mean I'm not your daughter?" My father's hands continued to shake as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, yellowed envelope. The edges were worn, like it had been handled countless times over the years. He placed it on the desk between us, and I stared at it like it was a venomous snake ready to strike. "Your mother," he said, and even that simple phrase felt like a dagger to my heart, "your biological mother, was our housekeeper. Maria Santos." Maria Santos. The name hit me like a physical blow. I remembered her. Vague, fragmented memories from when I was very small. A woman with gentle hands and a soft voice who would sing to me in Spanish. A woman who disappeared from our house when I was about 5 years old. I had asked about her once, and my father had told me she went back to her family in Mexico. "Maria worked for us for almost 6 years, my father continued, his voice growing stronger, more cruel with each word. "She was beautiful, young, vulnerable. Your mother, my wife, she couldn't have children. The doctors said it was impossible. But I wanted an heir. I wanted someone to carry on the family name." I felt nauseous. The room was spinning, and I could barely process what he was telling me. "Are you saying that you—" "I'm saying that I took advantage of Maria's situation. She needed the job, needed the money to send back to her family. And I needed a child. So yes, Margaret, I fathered you with the help. But you were never meant to be my daughter. You were meant to be a secret." The cruelty in his words was breathtaking. I had spent my entire life trying to earn his love, his approval, his recognition, and now I was learning that my very existence was something he considered a mistake, a secret to be hidden. "But then what happened? Why did you raise me as your daughter?" His laugh was bitter, cold. "Because Maria died in childbirth with my wife's second pregnancy." "Yes, Margaret, Maria was pregnant again. My wife had accepted the first arrangement, convinced herself that you were a gift from God. But when Maria became pregnant again, it was too much. The stress, the shame, the guilt, it killed both Maria and the baby. I felt like I was drowning." Every word he spoke pulled me deeper underwater, farther from the surface, farther from air. "So you kept me?" My wife insisted. She said we had already committed the sin, might as well reap the benefit. "You became our daughter, officially. We told everyone you were adopted after my wife's miscarriages. But you were never really ours, Margaret. You were always Maria's daughter, raised in a house built on lies." The inheritance papers sat on the desk between us, suddenly meaningless. Everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for, was based on a foundation of deception and shame. I was not the daughter of privilege I had believed myself to be. I was the daughter of a housekeeper who had been exploited and ultimately died because of my father's selfish desires. "But I built this business," I whispered, grasping for something, anything, to hold on to. "I made it what it is today." "Yes, you did," he acknowledged, but there was no pride in his voice. "You were useful, Margaret. Very useful. But useful and family are not the same thing." Mr. Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps we should take a break." "No," my father said firmly. He reached for the inheritance papers and, before I could stop him, he ripped them in half. The sound of tearing paper was like thunder in the quiet room. "This fortune was never yours, it belongs to the family. The real family." I stared at the torn papers, watching pieces of my life flutter to the floor like autumn leaves. "What real family?" "My nephew, David. He's flying in from Chicago tomorrow to take over the business. He's young, capable, and most importantly, he's blood. Real blood." The betrayal was complete. Not only was I not his biological daughter, but I was being replaced by someone who had never contributed a single day to building what we had created together. "David," A man I barely knew, who had chosen a career in finance over the family business, who had never shown any interest in construction or in continuing my father's legacy. "You can't be serious," I said, standing up so quickly my chair fell backward. "David doesn't know anything about this business. He's never worked a day in construction. He doesn't understand our clients, our contracts, our employees." "He'll learn," my father said dismissively. "He has time. He's only 32. The implication was clear. Unlike me, at 54, David had youth on his side. Unlike me, he had the one thing I could never have, the right blood running through his veins. I looked at Mr. Morrison, desperate for some kind of support, some kind of legal recourse. But his expression told me everything I needed to know. This had all been planned. The papers had been prepared with David's name, not mine. I had been brought here not to receive my inheritance, but to be told I never had one in the first place. "I need to go," I said, my voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "I need time to process this." "Margaret, wait," my father called as I headed for the door. "You can stay on as an employee. David will need someone with experience to guide him through the transition." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. Employee. After 35 years of building his empire, after sacrificing my own dreams and relationships, after believing I was working towards something meaningful, I was being offered a position as an employee under someone who knew nothing about the business I had created. "I'll think about it," I lied, because it was the only way I could get out of that room without completely falling apart. But as I walked out of that office, past the secretary who had always greeted me with respect, past the waiting area where I had sat so many times discussing business deals and contracts, I knew I would never be back. Not as an employee, not as a daughter, not as anything. I was 54 years old, and I had just learned that everything I thought I knew about myself was a lie. The drive home was a blur of tears and rage. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white, and more than once I had to pull over because I couldn't see through the tears. How could he do this to me? How could the man I had devoted my life to caring for turn around and destroy me so completely? But even through the devastation, something else was growing inside me. Something darker, more determined. If my father thought he could discard me like yesterday's newspaper after everything I had done for him, he was about to learn just how wrong he could be. I might not be his biological daughter, but I had learned from the best when it came to business, strategy, and getting what I wanted. And what I wanted now was the truth. All of it. About Maria Santos, about my real heritage, and about the empire I had built with my own hands. If they thought I was going to disappear quietly, they didn't know Margaret Santos at all. The house felt different when I walked through the front door that evening. The same furniture, the same family photos on the mantel, the same Persian rugs my father had insisted on buying, but everything felt hollow now, like a movie set that looked real from a distance but revealed its fakeness up close. I stood in the living room, staring at those family photos with new eyes. There I was at graduations, birthdays, holidays, always smiling, always trying to please, always hoping for a look of pride that I now realized never came. And there was my father, always maintaining just enough distance in every photo to create doubt about our connection, though I had been too desperate for his approval to see it at the time. But it was the absence of photos that suddenly struck me. In 35 years of living in this house, I had never seen a single picture of Maria Santos. Not in any family album, not tucked away in drawers, not even in the basement where my father kept old business documents. It was as if she had been completely erased from our family history, as if my biological mother had never existed at all. I went to my father's study, a room I had been in countless times to discuss business matters, but now I was seeing it with different eyes. The massive mahogany desk, the wall of legal books, the filing cabinets that contained decades of family and business documents. If there were any traces of Maria Santos left in this house, they would be here. I started with the desk drawers, methodically going through files of bank statements, insurance papers, old contracts. Nothing. Then I moved to the filing cabinets, searching through folders marked with years, names, business deals. Still nothing. It was as if Maria Santos had been systematically erased from every record, every document, every trace of our family history. But I knew my father better than anyone. He was meticulous, obsessive about record-keeping, and despite his cruelty, he was also sentimental in his own twisted way. There had to be something, somewhere. I was about to give up when I noticed something odd about the bottom drawer of the largest filing cabinet. It seemed shallower than the others, as if there were a false bottom. I ran my fingers along the edges until I found a small lever, and when I pressed it, a hidden compartment opened. Inside was a small collection of items that took my breath away. A Mexican birth certificate with my name on it, listing Maria Santos as my mother and my father as unknown. A small silver locket that must have belonged to Maria. And most shocking of all, a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. My hands shook as I untied the ribbon and opened the first letter. It was written in Spanish, in beautiful, flowing handwriting, and it was addressed to me. Mi querida Margaret, it began. My dear Margaret. I had taken Spanish in high school, but my skills were rusty. Still, I could make out enough to understand the general meaning, and what I read broke my heart all over again. These were letters from Maria to me, written during her pregnancy with my younger sibling, the pregnancy that would ultimately kill her. In the letters, she told me about her dreams for my future. She wrote about how much she loved me, how proud she was of my intelligence, how she hoped I would grow up to be strong and independent. She wrote about her own mother back in Mexico, my grandmother, who was still alive when these letters were written. But it was the final letter, dated just a week before her death, that changed everything. In that letter, Maria revealed a truth that my father had hidden from everyone. She had discovered that my father had been embezzling money from his business partners, using creative accounting to hide the theft. She had seen the documents, understood what they meant, and had confronted him about it. More importantly, she had made copies of those documents and hidden them somewhere safe, along with a will she had written leaving her portion of the business to me. Yes, her portion. Because Maria Santos had not just been a housekeeper. She had been my father's business partner, though he had never given her official credit for her contributions. The construction business had been struggling when Maria started working for our family. But she had brought with her connections in the Hispanic community, connections that led to contracts, laborers, and ultimately, the foundation of what would become our empire. She had invested her own money, her own ideas, her own network into making the business successful. And according to her will, her share of that business belonged to me. I sat in that study until the sun came up, reading and rereading those letters, trying to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. Not only had my father betrayed me personally, he had also stolen my legal inheritance, the inheritance that came from my biological mother's contributions to the business. But Maria had been smarter than my father gave her credit for. In her final letter, she told me exactly where to find the evidence I would need to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Write in the comments if you've ever discovered a family secret that changed your entire understanding of who you are. Subscribe to hear how this story ends, because Margaret's journey is just beginning. The address Maria had written in her final letter led me to a small storage unit on the outskirts of town, in a facility that had been operating for over 30 years. Unit 247. The key was taped inside the silver locket, just as she had written. Standing in front of that storage unit, I felt like I was about to open a door into my real past, into the truth that had been hidden from me for half a century. My hands trembled as I inserted the key and rolled up the metal door. Inside was a treasure trove of documents, photographs, and personal items that painted a picture of Maria Santos that was completely different from the helpless victim my father had described. These weren't the belongings of a simple housekeeper. These were the possessions of an educated, ambitious woman who had been building her own version of the American dream. There were business school textbooks with her notes in the margins, written in both Spanish and English. There were architectural drawings for construction projects, some in her handwriting, with calculations and material estimates that I recognized as the foundation for some of our most successful jobs. There were photographs of her on construction sites, not as a bystander, but clearly as someone in charge, directing workers and inspecting progress. But most importantly, there were the legal documents. Partnership agreements between Maria Santos and my father, dated back to the early days of the business. Bank statements showing her investments in equipment and materials. Contracts with suppliers and subcontractors, many signed by Maria herself as co-owner of Santos and Mitchell Construction. Santos and Mitchell. Not Mitchell Construction, as it had been called for as long as I could remember. My father had literally erased Maria's name from the business she had helped build. I spent hours in that storage unit, going through every box, every file, every photograph. And slowly, a picture emerged of a woman who had been far more than just my biological mother. She had been a brilliant businesswoman, a savvy investor, and a strategic thinker who had turned my father's struggling construction company into the foundation of what would eventually become a multi-million-dollar empire. Among the financial documents, I found evidence of the embezzlement Maria had discovered. My father had been systematically skimming money from contracts, falsifying invoices, and hiding assets in personal accounts. But Maria had documented everything, creating a paper trail that would hold up in any court. More shocking still, I found evidence that Maria's death had not been the tragic accident my father had always described. Hospital records showed that she had been admitted for complications during pregnancy, but the complications had been caused by stress and physical trauma that was consistent with abuse. Maria Santos had not died from natural causes. She had been killed by the stress and violence of a situation she could not escape. In the bottom of the last box, I found Maria's personal journal, written in the months before her death. The entries painted a picture of a woman trapped in an impossible situation, desperate to protect her children but unable to escape the control of a man who held all the power. "He thinks he owns me," she wrote in one entry. "He thinks because I am an immigrant, because I needed work, because I am alone in this country, that he can do whatever he wants to me. But he is wrong. I am building something for my children, something that will survive even if I don't." And she had. She had built a legal case against my father, documented his crimes, and created a roadmap for justice that had waited 30 years for someone to discover it. But the most important discovery was a sealed envelope marked, "For Margaret," on her 18th birthday. Inside was a letter and a set of legal documents that took my breath away. "My beloved daughter," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means that I am no longer with you, but it also means that you are old enough and strong enough to handle the truth about who you really are and what really belongs to you." The legal documents were explosive. Not only had Maria been co-owner of the construction business, but she had also purchased land, invested in real estate, and accumulated assets that my father had been illegally controlling for decades. According to her will, all of these assets should have been transferred to me when I turned 18. The total value, with 36 years of appreciation and growth, was staggering. Maria Santos had not been a poor housekeeper who died tragically young. She had been a wealthy businesswoman whose assets had been stolen by the man who fathered her child. But more than the money, more than the property, more than the business ownership, the documents contained something even more valuable, evidence of a trust fund that Maria had established for my education and future, funded by her portion of the business profits. A trust fund that my father had been illegally accessing for decades. I sat in that storage unit as the sun set, surrounded by the evidence of my true heritage, and I felt something I had never experienced before. Not just anger at my father's betrayal, but pride in my real mother. Pride in her intelligence, her courage, her determination to protect her children even in the face of impossible circumstances. Maria Santos had not been a victim. She had been a warrior, fighting a battle that she knew she might not survive, but ensuring that her children would have the weapons they needed to continue the fight. And now, 36 years later, I finally had those weapons in my hands. The next morning, I called in sick to the office for the first time in 15 years. Instead of going to work, I went to see the best attorney in the state, one who specialized in inheritance disputes and corporate fraud. When I walked into the office of Catherine Reynolds, Esquire, I carried with me 3 boxes of evidence that would transform Maria Santos from a forgotten housekeeper into the co-founder of a multi-million-dollar empire. Catherine was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened without interruption as I told her my story, from the devastating revelation in Mr. Morrison's office to the treasure trove of evidence I had discovered in the storage unit. When I finished talking, she was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the documents I had brought. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression that was part amazement and part fierce determination. "Margaret," she said, "this is one of the most comprehensive cases of inheritance fraud I have ever seen. Your father hasn't just stolen your inheritance. He's been running a criminal enterprise for over 30 years, using your mother's assets and her portion of the business to fund his lifestyle while denying you your legal rights. She spread the partnership agreements across her desk, pointing to signatures and dates that told the real story of Santos and Mitchell Construction. According to these documents, your mother owned 51% of the business when she died. That means you should have inherited controlling interest in the company on your 18th birthday. But I never knew any of this existed, I said. How was my father able to hide it for so long? Because he had control of all the records, and because your mother died before she could ensure you received these documents. He's been committing fraud on a massive scale, and he's been using your labor to increase the value of assets that legally belong to you. Catherine leaned back in her chair, and I could see her legal mind working through the implications. Margaret, if we pursue this case, we're not just talking about getting you an inheritance. We're talking about you recovering property that has been stolen from you for 36 years, plus damages, plus interest. We're talking about criminal charges for embezzlement, fraud, and possibly even manslaughter, given the circumstances of your mother's death. The word of manslaughter hit me like a physical blow. You think my father killed my mother? I think your father created conditions that led to your mother's death, and then profited from that death by stealing assets that belonged to her children. Whether that rises to the level of criminal charges would be up to a prosecutor, but the civil case alone would be devastating for him. She pulled out a calculator and started running numbers based on the business valuations and property assessments in Maria's documents. The total she arrived at made my head spin. With 36 years of growth, appreciation, and compound interest, my father owed me over $12 million. But Margaret, Catherine said, her voice becoming serious, if we pursue this case, there's no going back. Your father will fight this with everything he has, and it will destroy whatever relationship you have left with him. Are you prepared for that? I thought about the man who had raised me, who had taught me everything I knew about business and construction, who had been the central figure in my life for 54 years. Then I thought about Maria Santos, the woman who had died protecting her children, whose legacy had been stolen and buried for decades. Catherine, I said, I've spent my entire life trying to earn my father's love and approval. I sacrificed my own dreams, my own relationships, my own happiness, trying to be the daughter he wanted me to be. But I was never going to be enough for him, because I was never really his daughter. I was Maria Santos' daughter, and it's time I started honoring her memory instead of begging for his approval. Catherine smiled, and I could see that she understood exactly what this meant to me. This wasn't just about money or property. This was about justice for a woman who had been silenced for too long, and about reclaiming an identity that had been stolen from me before I was old enough to defend it. Then let's get started, she said, reaching for her phone. I'm going to file an emergency injunction to prevent your father from transferring any assets while we build our case. By this time tomorrow, he won't be able to sell so much as a stapler without court approval. As Catherine made the call, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades, hope. Real, genuine hope that justice was possible, that truth could prevail over lies, that the little girl who had lost her mother could finally honor her memory. My father thought he had destroyed me in that lawyer's office yesterday. But he had actually set me free. Free from the desperate need for his approval, free from the lies that had shaped my entire life, free to become who I was always meant to be. I was Margaret Santos, daughter of Maria Santos, heir to a legacy of strength, intelligence, and business acumen that had been denied to me for far too long. And I was about to remind everyone exactly what that meant. The emergency injunction was granted within 24 hours, faster than Catherine had expected. Judge Harrison, after reviewing the evidence of potential fraud and asset manipulation, immediately froze all of my father's personal and business accounts pending further investigation. I was at my desk, pretending to work on routine construction estimates, when my father burst into my office without knocking. His face was red with fury, and for the first time in my life, I saw him completely out of control. "What the hell did you do?" he shouted, slamming a legal document down on my desk. "How dare you file a lawsuit against me? After everything I've done for you, after giving you a home, a job, a life, this is how you repay me?" I looked up at him calmly, and I realized that the devastation I had felt yesterday had transformed into something much more powerful: clarity. I'm reclaiming what belongs to me, Dad. What belonged to my mother? Your mother was a maid who got pregnant and died. That's all she was. Everything you have, everything you are, you owe to me. No, I said, standing up behind my desk, meeting his eyes for the first time in our relationship as equals. Maria Santos was a brilliant businesswoman who co-founded this company and left me an inheritance that you've been stealing for 36 years. Everything I am, I owe to her. His laugh was ugly, desperate. You think some old documents and a dead woman's fantasy are going to hold up in court? I built this business. I made it successful. You were just along for the ride. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a folder I had prepared that morning. Inside were copies of Maria's architectural drawings, her supplier contracts, her client negotiations, all documented proof of her central role in building our empire. I spread them across the desk between us. Maria Santos designed the Rodriguez shopping center that brought us our first $1 million profit. She negotiated the exclusive contract with Medina Steel that gave us competitive advantage for 15 years. She identified and purchased the land that became our headquarters. She wasn't along for the ride, Dad. She was driving. For the first time since I'd known him, my father was speechless. He stared at the documents, and I could see in his eyes the moment when he realized that his carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. David will be here tomorrow, he finally said, his voice much quieter now. He's still going to take over the business. No, he's not, I replied calmly. Because as of this morning, I own 51% of Santos and Mitchell Construction, which means I have controlling interest. David can visit if he wants, but he won't be taking over anything. The color drained from his face. You can't do this to me. I'm your father. You're not my father, I said, and the words felt liberating instead of painful. You're the man who stole my mother's assets and spent 36 years making me believe I had to earn what already belonged to me. But that ends today. He stood there for a long moment, and I could see him calculating, trying to figure out some way to regain control of the situation. But there was no way back from this. The evidence was too strong, the legal case too solid, the truth too clear. You're making a mistake, Margaret, he said finally. You think you can run this business without me? You think these Mexican contractors and suppliers are going to respect you without my backing? You're about to find out how hard the real world can be. I'm about to find out who I really am, I corrected him. And I'm about to honor the memory of the woman who made all of this possible. After he left, I sat in my office for a long time, looking out at the construction yard that had been my world for so many years. Workers were loading equipment, managing projects, building the future one day at a time. Many of them were Hispanic, part of the network that Maria Santos had built decades ago, still loyal to the company she had helped create. I thought about calling a meeting, announcing the change in ownership, explaining the situation to my employees. But first, I had something more important to do. I drove to the cemetery where Maria Santos was buried, something I had never done because I had never known where she was. Her grave was in a small, neglected section reserved for immigrants and the poor, marked only with a simple stone that read, Maria Santos, 1965 to 1989, beloved mother. I knelt beside her grave and placed a bouquet of white roses on the weathered stone. I found them, Mama, I whispered, using a word I had never spoken aloud before. I found your letters, your documents, your plans. I found the truth about who you were and what you built. And I promise you, I'm going to make it right. I'm going to honor your memory and build on the legacy you left for me. The wind rustled through the trees above her grave, and for a moment, I could swear I heard the echo of a lullaby in Spanish, the same melody that lived in the deepest corners of my childhood memory. I was 54 years old, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged. I was Margaret Santos, daughter of Maria Santos, heir to a legacy of courage, intelligence, and determination. And I was just getting started. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of Santos and Mitchell Construction, looking out at the faces of our expanded management team. The business had grown by 40% since I had taken control, powered by contracts from the Hispanic community that had been waiting decades for someone who understood their needs and respected their contributions. David had come to visit, just as my father had promised, but after reviewing the legal situation and the company's financial records, he had decided that a career in finance was more appealing than a lengthy court battle over construction assets. My father had moved to Florida, where he was living on the pension fund that the court had allowed him to keep after he had repaid the money he had embezzled from Maria's estate. The silver locket that had belonged to my mother now hung around my neck, and inside it was a new photograph, Maria Santos standing on a construction site, smiling confidently at the camera, looking every inch the successful businesswoman she had been. Before we begin today's meeting, I announced to my team, I want to share something with all of you. Many of you have worked for this company for years, and you've heard different stories about how it was founded and who built it. Today, I want you to know the real story. I told them about Maria Santos, about her vision and her contributions, about the network of contractors and suppliers she had cultivated, about the architectural designs and business strategies that had made our success possible. I told them how she had been erased from the company's history, but how her legacy had survived in the documents and evidence she had carefully preserved. This company was built on the foundation that Maria Santos created, I concluded. And from now on, we're going to honor that foundation and build on it. We're going to be the company she envisioned, one that respects all workers, that serves all communities, and that remembers where it came from. The room erupted in applause, but it was Manuel Rodriguez, our longest-serving foreman, who said what everyone was thinking, "It's about time, Señora Margaret. Your mother would be proud." As the meeting continued and we discussed new projects, expanded contracts, and plans for the future, I felt something I had never experienced before, the deep satisfaction of living authentically, of honoring my true heritage, of building on a legacy that belonged to me by right and by blood. I thought about my father, alone in his Florida retirement, probably still believing that he was the victim in this story. He would never understand that by trying to erase Maria Santos from history, he had actually ensured that her story would eventually be told with even greater power and impact. The construction business that now bore her name properly was thriving in ways it never had under his control. We had opened a scholarship fund for the children of immigrant workers, we had established partnerships with Hispanic-owned businesses throughout the region, and we had become the contractor of choice for community organizations that had been ignored for decades. But perhaps most importantly, I had reconnected with my mother's family in Mexico. Using the information in her letters, I had tracked down my grandmother, Elena Santos, who was 93 years old and still living in the same small town where Maria had been born. Through tearful video calls conducted in my rusty but improving Spanish, I learned about the woman who had given me life. Elena told me stories about Maria's childhood, her dreams of education and success, her determination to build a better life for her family. She showed me photographs of Maria as a young woman, and I was struck by how much we looked alike, how much of her strength I could see in my own face. She wrote to us about you, Elena told me during one of our calls. She said you were smart like her, stubborn like her, that you would grow up to do great things. She was right, Mija. She was always right. Through Elena, I met cousins and aunts and uncles I never knew existed, a whole family that welcomed me with open arms and treated me not as the illegitimate daughter of a difficult situation, but as Maria's child, deserving of love and belonging simply because I existed. For my 55th birthday, I did something I had never done before. I celebrated with my real family. Elena had been too frail to travel, but 12 of my relatives made the trip from Mexico to Texas to meet me for the first time. We spent a week together, sharing stories, cooking traditional foods, and learning about each other's lives. On the final evening of their visit, my cousin Rosa, who was closest to my age, pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Margaret," she said, "there's something Abuela Elena wanted me to tell you. Something she was afraid to say over the phone." She handed me an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed to Maria Santos but never opened. "This came to our house about 6 months after your mother died. Abuela was too grief-stricken to open it then, and later, she forgot about it. But when you contacted us, she remembered." I opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from a law office in Mexico City, dated 6 months after Maria's death. The letter was brief but shocking. Maria's grandfather had died and left his estate to his American granddaughter, continuing on her claim being filed within 1 year of his death. The estate included a ranch, mineral rights, and a substantial bank account that had been growing with interest for over 30 years. The total value, in today's currency, was over $2 million. "Rosa," I whispered, "does this mean?" "It means your mother's family has been trying to find you for over 30 years, she said, tears streaming down her face. "It means there's an inheritance in Mexico that belongs to you, that has been waiting for you all this time." The next morning, as my relatives prepared to return to Mexico, they made me promise to visit soon, to meet Elena in person, and to explore the possibility of claiming what my great-grandfather had left for me. But more than that, they made me understand that I was not just reclaiming a business legacy from my father's theft. I was discovering a cultural legacy, a family legacy, a heritage that connected me to generations of strong, determined women who had fought for their families and their dreams. Standing in my office that following Monday, looking out at the construction projects that now carried both my mother's name and her values, I felt a completeness I had never experienced before. The desperate need for my father's approval had been replaced by the solid foundation of knowing who I really was and where I really came from. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Catherine Reynolds, my attorney, and her voice was excited. "Margaret, I have news. The prosecutors have decided to file criminal charges against your father for embezzlement and fraud. They want you to testify at the trial." I had been dreading this possibility, the thought of facing my father in court, of having to testify about the years of lies and manipulation. But now, with the strength of my mother's legacy behind me and the support of my real family around me, the prospect didn't seem frightening anymore. "When is the trial?" I asked. "It's scheduled for next month." "Margaret, I want you to know that your testimony will be crucial. You're the only person who can speak to the full extent of how his actions affected you personally." After I hung up the phone, I walked over to the wall where I had hung an enlarged photograph of Maria Santos, standing confidently on a construction site, hard hat in her hands, looking directly at the camera with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and determination. Below the photograph was a brass nameplate that read, "Maria Santos, co-founder, Santos and Mitchell Construction, 1962 to 1989. "Don't worry, Mama," I said quietly. "I'll tell them everything. I'll make sure the world knows exactly who you were and what you accomplished. I'll make sure your story is finally heard." The trial lasted 2 weeks, and every day, I wore Maria's silver locket as I testified about the decades of lies, the stolen documents, the erased history, and the systematic theft of assets that rightfully belonged to her children. My father sat at the defendant's table, looking older and smaller than I remembered, but he never once looked me in the eyes. When the jury returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, I felt not triumph, but a deep sense of peace. Justice had been served, not just for me, but for Maria Santos, whose memory had been vindicated and whose legacy was now secure. 6 months later, I stood at the podium in the ballroom of the city's most prestigious hotel, addressing the annual Hispanic Business Association Awards dinner. Santos and Mitchell Construction had been named Business of the Year, but more importantly, I was presenting the first annual Maria Santos Memorial Scholarship to 5 young women who were pursuing careers in architecture and construction. These scholarships, I told the audience, honor the memory of a woman who understood that building a business means building a community, that success means lifting others up with you, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is not money or property, but the example of courage, determination, and integrity. In the audience, I could see Elena, who had finally made the journey from Mexico to see her granddaughter receive recognition for honoring her daughter's memory. Beside her sat my cousins, my new family, the family that Maria Santos would have wanted me to know and love. As I left the podium to thunderous applause, I thought about the woman I had been just 2 years earlier, desperate for approval, working tirelessly for recognition that would never come, believing that my worth was determined by how well I could serve someone else's dreams. That woman was gone. In her place stood Margaret Santos, successful businesswoman, devoted daughter to Maria Santos, proud member of a family that valued strength and integrity above all else. I had spent 54 years trying to earn love from a man who was never capable of giving it. Now I was surrounded by people who loved me simply because I existed, because I was Maria's daughter, because I belonged to a family that understood the value of loyalty and truth. The little girl who had lost her mother before she could know her had finally come home. And the woman who had built an empire while believing she was just an employee had finally claimed her rightful place as the heir to a legacy of courage, intelligence, and unshakable determination. If you've ever felt like you didn't belong in your own family, if you've ever wondered about the stories that shaped your life, write in the comments below. And subscribe to hear more stories about the power of truth, the strength of family, and the courage it takes to reclaim what belongs to you. Because sometimes, the inheritance we're meant to receive isn't money or property. Sometimes, it's the knowledge of who we really are and where we really belong. And sometimes, that's worth more than all the money in the world.